Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a non-spoiler book review for Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. This is a very fresh and unique perspective on the fantasy genre. The main setting that the book takes place in would be the Sword of Kaigen, which is this strip of land where the inhabitants are very loyal to their emperor and they are very traditional in their values. They very much have a passion for being warriors. They believe that is kind of their calling, and that particular calling shapes pretty much every aspect of their lives. The book itself does touch on some other places and the fact that these particular themes and customs in this land are not necessarily true for the rest of the world, which kind of makes the Sword of Kaigen a little bit of an outlier. And we see this clash a little bit with our two main perspectives, Misaki and Mamoru. Misaki is the mother character. She has a little bit of a mysterious past, but she's resigned herself to the life of a housewife. There's definitely a lot of sexism present in these traditional values on this island, and she's kind of had to succumb to these for the safety of her family. And then the other perspective would be her son Mamoru. He is one of her 4 sons. Mamoru is a 14-year-old boy who loves everything to do with being a warrior. He's amazing at training, but it is peacetime, so this love is slightly clouded by optimism and not really a sense of reality of what war actually is like. The book is broken up into essentially 3 different parts, where you have the introduction, the exposition. In the center of it all, you have a lot of intense action, and then you have a lot of consequences as a result. By having it set up this way, you definitely get to know Misaki and Mamoru very well at the beginning, but I definitely felt like the beginning was very exposition heavy in that it was all about, let me show you the sexism in the world, let me show you their customs, let me tell you about the fact they're a little bit brainwashed, the propaganda that's used. It's showing you all of these things a little bit straightforwardly, which is going to appeal to some people because this book is so unique in that it's Japanese inspired, but in a world that is advanced in its technology. So you will see some people have what are essentially like cell phones, and people drive vehicles and things like that in other places, but here it is slightly different. So you have this very interesting fantasy world. Most of us, I think, are used to sword and sorcery, medieval-esque type fantasy, and this is more along the lines of a Final Fantasy game where there's technology and there's references to the government and corruption and things like that, but also people still fight with swords. And there's also magic in this particular land. The magic system is based a lot in the purity of bloodlines, which also plays a role in some of their more traditional values, because the freedom to love who you want to love is not really an option when they're trying to keep the bloodline as pure as possible. But either way, you get a lot of this exposition, and it's told to you quite forwardly, because I think there's so much to take in that forwardness is going to be very appealing to some people who might be daunted by a lot of what's very different from what they're accustomed to in fantasy. But at the same time, if you like a little bit more nuanced with your introductions, I think the first chunk of the book, first couple hundred pages, 150, 200 pages, are probably not going to be very appealing to you. In fact, I personally was thinking initially that I was not going to like this book at all. Also, a lot of the exposition not only is a little on the nose, but it's through the perspective of the younger characters mostly. So they go to school and you'll see them at school and they're getting a history lesson and they're like, but wait, how could this possibly not be the way things are? And they're a little bit, I tabbed a lot of times that a character would go, wait, what? But how? And they do that quite a lot in the beginning, which is kind of a stand-in for you as the reader to ask those same questions. But if you keep going and you like action, the action in the middle chunk is pretty cool. The action sequences are really well played out, and you can definitely visualize it. The way that the magic ties into the action scenes is done really well. It's very similar to if you're watching an anime, or like I said earlier, reference to video games, that kind of action, this otherworldly, that's what magic is. Obviously, it's not a thing. It's not actually real, but the way that it just seems larger than life is done really well. So the action scenes are really fascinating and really exciting and high stakes. And because you're following a mother and her son, the stakes are more personal and more emotionally driven because it's not just a single character. But you don't get very often in fantasy a mother trying to protect her family viciously and a child who really has never experienced violence before but wants so hard to fight for their family, make their family proud, and be a great warrior. And I feel like just in describing it, it's kind of an emotional setup. And war sucks. And I think that the book does a great job of showcasing that in the third act, I guess you could call it, because I think a lot of people are going to find the third act to be strange because we're so accustomed to having action at the end of our books. So to have it in the middle, for some people, it's going to feel like the pacing is off because it feels like the big stuff happened in the middle. But I think that the third act actually is more of the climactic moment of the book because while the action scenes are written very well and they're very captivating, I actually feel like the story is more about the growth of the characters and the awareness that comes from being slightly brainwashed or having a society set up the way that their society is. So it's kind of a shift for the characters and their growth or the lack of growth that you might get as a result of these more violent things. Not that there's anything wrong with anybody feeling that the middle chunk should have been at the end. It's all, of course, subjective and opinion-based and whatever your preferences are. But I actually really liked the fact that it was so much more emotionally driven. It made what happened in the middle matter more. One of my pet peeves in fantasy is when really sad things happen and then people just kind of get over it or they don't reflect on anything. That doesn't seem like these events were really that big of a deal if the characters have no reactions to it or if you don't see anything and it's kind of like, we won, so it's happy now, or we lost, so I guess that's it. And there's just not much examination. And I really like that so much of the book was that examination. I do think that in having this as the last chunk of the book, that some people are going to feel like it kind of drags on and on and on. My personal feelings is that I absolutely loved that that was the direction the last chunk went in. I didn't feel it dragged on and on and on until the last chapter. That last chapter, it wasn't the content that's in it, and obviously I can't give away spoilers. It's not the content in its concept that bothered me. It was the fact that the last chapter almost felt like a bridge to another series. So, for example, sometimes you'll have a completed trilogy or a completed series, and then you'll get some kind of little novella that sort of sets you up for a continuation series, and that's what the last chapter felt like. And I'm very picky about my endings, so I would have liked if this book would have certainly felt like it had its own ending, and then I don't mind room for other books, but this is a standalone. If there are other books, it's going to be other books in this world, not necessarily a direct sequel to this book. And I don't know that I want, with how emotional this book was, I don't want that for my ending because it weirdly takes me out of the story and is reminding me that I'm reading a book within a shared world where other things are also happening, and I just want to focus on the things that are happening in this book. So I don't know, that ending for me almost negated how emotional and how much depth the rest of the last chunk had, and I don't know now how I feel about it. I think it had the most exceptional lows, and when I say lows, I mean the really sad emotional stuff I think was phenomenal, but with a beginning that I didn't really love, and then having an end that sort of lessened my enjoyment of most of the ending, I feel conflicted about it. I certainly think that this book is very good, and I do understand if you're reading that first chunk and you're like, I don't know, because I would encourage you, if you pick it up, you gotta push through the beginning. If you don't want to, that's fine. But I think it's one of those books where you might not be hooked right from the start. In a way, it almost had pacing issues for me as well, which seems to be a common criticism for others. I just don't think my pacing issues are quite the same as other people's. Other people seem to want the second act shifted or for the last part to be shorter, whereas I more just wanted the content of the end to remain with the similar tone that we're getting, and then maybe for my own personal taste, I would have liked a little more nuance with the exposition at the beginning. The action definitely lasts a while. For my own personal taste, maybe a little too long at some points. I don't know that I always needed so much. I still think that the emotions that this book is able to evoke, it does it in such a great way that it absolutely is something I would recommend, because I think that even if you have some cons, that those emotions might be enough to make it so the cons don't even matter to you. This is a book that I think a lot of people are going to love with all their heart, but will also be like, oh yeah, definitely this one thing though is definitely this way, or this is definitely a con of this book, even though they love it, because the emotions are so well done, because the themes are so important and heavy and deep. It's an interesting book. It's very different from most every other fantasy I've ever read, so I highly recommend it, but I also kind of recommend it with a little bit of an asterisk by it. If you have read this, definitely feel free to let me know and other people know your perspectives on it. If you want to mention spoilers, which I'm sure some people do, just make sure that you write spoilers and then enter a bunch of times, because I was not expecting the direction that this book went in, and I think I would have been really bummed out if I had been spoiled for that, so I don't want anyone getting spoiled. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.